Welcome to Learn English. Enjoy easy lessons, vocabulary, and grammar, and speak English with confidence. Subscribe and start your English journey today.
Welcome to The Debate. So imagine you're an adult beginner learning English. You're at a coffee shop, you try to tell a simple story about your weekend, and you accidentally say, "I goyed to the supermarket."
Oh, rough.
Right? Your friends chuckle. It's not malicious, but in that moment, you just want the floor to open up and swallow you whole.
Yeah, it is a uniquely vulnerable feeling. Suddenly, the organic, messy process of learning a language feels like walking through a minefield blindfolded.
Exactly. And that exact pain point brings us to our focus today. We're looking at a foundational English curriculum built around the 8 most common irregular action verbs. Go, come, take, put, make, get, eat, and drink.
Right, the heavy hitters.
Yeah, the heavy hitters. And the central question before us is essentially the ultimate challenge in instructional design. When a curriculum designer is handed the mandate to please explain clearly for a beginner, how do they actually do it? Should they prioritize explicit rule-based categorization and, immediate error correction?
Or should they lean into implicit acquisition, focusing on immersive storytelling where fluency actually matters way more than getting the structure perfect?
Right.
And it's a profound divide in how we view the adult brain. I will be arguing that beginners learn most clearly through relatable context and natural storytelling. We don't need to treat the adult brain like a computer receiving lines of code.
But it kind of is a computer, isn't it?
I really don't think so. When we over-index on explicit rules, we actually risk paralyzing the learner. True clarity emerges when a learner feels safe enough to make mistakes, recognizing that the goal is human connection, not passing a grammar audit.
I actually see why you think that. But let me give you a slightly different perspective on what's happening under the hood. I'll be arguing that for a true beginner, clarity demands an explicit structural framework.
Even at the very beginning?
Especially at the very beginning. You need direct memorization and the logical correction of predictable errors. Without those boundaries, immersive storytelling just becomes overwhelming noise.
I think noise is a pretty harsh way to look at natural communication, but I know you have a specific reason for valuing that structure so highly.
I do. Before we get into the weeds of the specific techniques, let's look at the sheer chaos of English irregular verbs. Why are they so intimidating?
Well, because there's no pattern.
Exactly. If you learn that walk becomes walked and play becomes played, your brain builds a logical rule. Just add ed. But then you hit a word like go and the past tense is went. It shares 0 letters.
It sounds entirely unrelated. To an adult brain that craves patterns, that irregularity is terrifying. It feels like the language is actively trying to trick you.
Exactly. And this is where the source material provides a masterclass in explicit categorization. To please explain clearly for beginner, the instructor deliberately isolates the fact that these 8 high-frequency verbs outright refuse to follow the ED rule.
Right. They pull them out of the regular mix.
Right. And instead of just handing the student a list to memorize, they group them into semantic pairs.
You mean the opposing actions, right?
Yes. We have movement, so go as leaving, come as arriving. The instructor explicitly frames went and came as a round trip. Then we have hand actions. Take for picking something up, put for placing it down.
It's very visual.
It is. Explaining this to a beginner is like giving them a map before they enter a new city. These semantic pairs act as coordinates. The brain doesn't have to build a new, isolated neurological file for every single irregular word. It links them together with spatial and relational logic.
The map metaphor sounds incredibly reassuring on paper, but I have to say I come at it from a completely different way.
Oh, why is that?
Well, those pairs, while undeniably clever classroom tricks, they are essentially artificial constructs. They don't survive contact with the real world.
How so? I mean, the logic seems incredibly straightforward.
Because real language isn't a neat set of opposing magnets. Let's look at the verb get, which the instructor pairs with make in the category of making and getting.
Right.
The instructor actually has to pause the lesson and admit that get is doing everyone's job at once in English. I mean, it means to receive a message, to arrive home, to buy a coffee, and to become tired. It's a chameleon word.
It is incredibly versatile. Yes, I'll give you that.
But think about what that means for your map. How does an explicit map help a beginner navigate a word that has 4 completely different meanings depending entirely on the surrounding words?
Well, it provides a base.
It doesn't, really. The map fails when the territory is that complex. If you're a beginner constantly trying to reference your making versus getting coordinate, you're going to freeze mid-sentence.
Wait, let me stop you there. I don't think it freezes them at all. I'd argue it provides a necessary anchor.
An anchor that weighs them down.
No. An anchor that grounds them. Think about how the instructor handles the verb put. They explicitly point out that put is the laziest verb in English because the past tense is exactly the same as the present tense.
Right. Today I put, yesterday I put.
Exactly. By isolating that quirk and putting it in a structured category, it becomes memorable. The deliberate lack of a rule actually becomes the rule.
Sure. Put is an easy win because it doesn't change. But let's look at the actual evidence of learning in the source material.
Okay, let's look at it.
The learner doesn't prove their mastery when reciting those clever little pairs. The real breakthrough, the moment of genuine clarity, happens when all that scaffolding is ripped away.
You mean the story part?
Yes, the learner spontaneously strings together a story. I got home at 7, I was very hungry, I made a big sandwich, then I got a phone call.
Which is a beautiful sequence, I agree.
But notice what the learner says right after. They say, I didn't count, it just happened. That right there is the hallmark of implicit acquisition.
I don't think you can ignore the prep work, though.
The clear explanation didn't come from the categorization, though. It came from the practical necessity of describing an evening at home. The meaning is negotiated in the context of the sentence, not in the isolation of your semantic pair.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The reason the learner could say it just happened is precisely because the explicit framework had already been internalized.
You think the Paris did that?
Absolutely. You cannot have that kind of spontaneous narrative flow if you're constantly searching your working memory for basic building blocks. The structure has to be automated first.
But did the explicit structure automate it, or did the narrative context automate it?
I would argue the explicit structure did, and I can point to the exact mechanism the instructor uses to do it. It's a technique they call the error lab.
Oh, the intentional mistakes.
Right. And this gets to the heart of what explicit instruction really looks like. Instead of waiting for the student to make a mistake, the instructor intentionally models a logical but incorrect formulation.
Right, like the instructor will look at the student and say something like, "This morning I pewted my coffee on the desk," or "I eated eggs."
Exactly. And they force the learner to actively catch the error. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, well, I learned Spanish just by memorizing conjugation tables, you weren't wrong.
It's a classic method.
It is. But here's what the data says about why the error lab is so powerful. It creates cognitive dissonance. It directly contrasts the logical assumption that each should become eated with the correct irregular form ate.
It's a very deliberate trap.
It is, but think of it more like a vaccine. The instructor is essentially inoculating the student.
Inoculating?
Yes, by injecting a dead, harmless version of the mistake, saying pewted out loud in a safe space. The learner's brain builds cognitive antibodies against it.
Wow, okay. Antibodies.
And when the learner catches the teacher's mistake, they literally describe it as the best feeling ever. That deliberate error correction builds a robust, confident foundation.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the long-term psychological impact of hyper-focusing on errors like that? You call it a vaccine, but I look at it and see a microscope.
A microscope?
Yes, a microscope. The error lab might feel like a fun game and a safe, controlled one-on-one dynamic, but out in the wild, adult learners experience error correction as public humiliation.
I think that's overstating it.
Not at all. We have to trace this back to the very beginning of the material, to the exact story you opened the show with. The entire lesson is instigated by the learner's trauma of saying "I goyed" to the supermarket and having their friend laugh at them.
Which is exactly why we need to correct it so they don't say "I goyed" again.
But if our directive is to please explain clearly for beginner, we have to recognize that clarity is heavily dependent on the learner's emotional state. Have you ever heard linguists talk about the affective filter?
The emotional barrier to learning, right?
Exactly. It's essentially this massive mental wall of anxiety that shoots up when you're terrified of looking stupid.
Sure.
When you panic, your prefrontal cortex basically shuts down. You can't access your memory. You can't remember the semantic pairs. You can't remember the error lab. You just freeze.
But
let me finish this thought. Highlighting embarrassing mistakes, even intentionally, can inadvertently raise that beginner's anxiety, which counteracts the whole goal.
But leaving them uncorrected leaves them speaking broken English.
Not necessarily. The source material circles back to a much more forgiving philosophy. The instructor explicitly states that if you say go instead of went, nobody will laugh. They will understand you.
But it's still wrong.
The mistake still moves you forward, though. The realization that I go it is still fundamentally communicative is what lowers that mental wall of anxiety. The focus should be on the message, not the mechanics.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it completely conflates malicious real-world mockery with structured pedagogical correction.
I wouldn't call a friend laughing malicious.
Well, the friend laughing at I go it at a coffee shop is an unstructured, unhelpful response. It makes the learner feel small. The error lab flips that power dynamic entirely.
By having the teacher make the mistake?
Precisely. The instructor says unputed, making themselves the target. It empowers the learner to be the corrector. Furthermore, you cannot simply wave away the mechanics in favor of the message because the mechanics dictate the temporal reality of the message.
Okay, that sounds a bit philosophical. What do you mean by the temporal reality?
I mean that if you can't use the past tense, you are literally trapped in the present. If a learner consistently uses I go for past events because they are too afraid of the mechanics of went, their ability to communicate complex thoughts is severely stunted.
They can use time words like yesterday I go.
But they can't tell you properly what happened to them yesterday without the right verbs. And the material demonstrates that explicit drilling works to fix this.
You're referring to the rapid-fire quiz.
Yes. Look at the end of the lesson. The instructor demands no thinking, just answer. And the learner successfully recalls all 8 irregular forms: went, came, took, put, made, got, ate, drank, with 0 mistakes.
Right.
100% perfection. That is proof that explicit instruction works incredibly efficiently. Rote memory builds the necessary architectural foundation so that the brain doesn't have to work as hard during an actual conversation.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why that conclusion misreads the very evidence it cites.
Go ahead.
You are attributing that flawless quiz performance to the explicit memorization, but you are completely ignoring what happened literally 3 minutes before that quiz.
You mean the role play exercise?
Exactly. The instructor themselves rejects the premise that rote memorization caused the success. When the learner expresses shock at their own perfect performance, saying, "My brain just did it," the instructor replies with a crucial insight.
Your brain was working the whole time. You just didn't notice.
Yes.
But it was working on the rules they just learned.
No, it was working on the context. Why were they not noticing the rules? Because they were engaged in an immersive role play. They weren't reciting a spreadsheet of pairs.
But they were using the pairs.
They were acting out a physical scenario, going to a building, getting a message, taking a bus, eating lunch, drinking water. This touches on a concept called embodied cognition.
Learning through physical space and narrative.
Right. When the learner is physically imagining taking a bus or eating lunch, they are bypassing the short-term memory bottleneck. They aren't trying to remember an arbitrary grammar rule. They are anchoring the vocabulary to spatial awareness and personal narrative.
So you think the rules did nothing?
I think it was the communicative use of the verbs that cemented them, not the abstract rule learning.
But you are treating explicit instruction and immersive role play as if they are mutually exclusive.
I'm saying one did the heavy lifting.
And I'm saying the material clearly sequences them, so they rely on one another. The role play only functions because these explicit boundaries were drawn first.
I don't know if I agree with that.
Think about it. The learner could focus on the soup they were making in the role play because they had just spent 10 minutes explicitly dissecting the difference between make and get and practicing the error lab to ensure they wouldn't say maked.
So you think without the map, the role play fails?
Completely. If you throw a beginner into a role play without that explicit map, you don't get unconscious absorption. You get cognitive overload. They wouldn't be absorbing the language. They would be drowning in it.
Drowning.
Yes. The mandate to please explain clearly for beginner necessitates that we reduce the chaos of the English language into manageable logical units first. You achieve clarity through precision, structure, and the direct confrontation of those predictable errors. Then, and only then, can they roleplay effectively.
I would counter that the sequence you are defending creates an illusion of control. Yes, the instructor presented the rules first, but the learner's brain didn't truly map those words until they were forced to use them in a narrative.
They needed the rules to build the narrative.
You say a beginner drowns without explicit rules, but the material itself shows that a beginner can handle immense complexity if the context is relevant to their life.
You're thinking of the final homework challenge?
Yes. The learner is asked to tell a full story about their yesterday, and they weave together, got up, went to the kitchen, made eggs, ate everything, drank coffee, took my bag, and came home.
It is an undeniable success story.
That is 14 distinct past tense verbs representing all 8 targeted words used flawlessly in a continuous flow. But they didn't achieve this by visualizing your semantic coordinates. They achieved it by visualizing their own kitchen.
Well,
Their daily life became the classroom. When a learner realizes that their mistakes are not the enemy, and that the primary goal is simply not to be silent, that mental wall of anxiety we talked about, the affective filter, drops completely.
I see what you're saying.
The barrier to entry is lowered. They stop treating language as a mathematical equation to be solved and start treating it as a tool for sharing their reality. That is the deepest form of clarity.
It really is a fascinating transformation. We are looking at the exact same pedagogical outcome. You know, a learner who transitions from the embarrassment of saying I goid to the triumph of seamlessly narrating their morning routine using complex irregular verbs.
It's an incredible leap.
It is. But for my part, I maintain that this transformation is a testament to the power of explicit structure.
The scaffolding, as you put it.
Yes, the scaffolding. For a beginner, the English language is a chaotic, irrational landscape. To navigate it, they require a systematic reduction of that chaos. By grouping verbs into semantic pairings and by utilizing deliberate contrastive techniques like the error lab to root out logical but incorrect assumptions, the educator provides a secure, predictable framework.
And you think that's the core?
Absolutely. The rules and the direct corrections are not barriers to fluency. They are the very scaffolding that makes that beautiful eventual fluency possible.
And as we summarize, I maintain that the scaffolding you praise is entirely secondary to the true driver of acquisition, which is meaningful context. A beginner learns most clearly when the language is tethered to their actual life, not isolated in artificial classroom pairs.
Even with the chameleons like get?
Especially then. The sheer versatility of a word like get proves that strict rules often break down in the face of natural communication.
Because context negotiates the meaning.
Exactly. The material succeeds because it ultimately prioritizes narrative flow and psychological safety over grammatical perfection. By reinforcing that silence is the enemy, the educator lowers the stakes. They allow the learner's unconscious brain to absorb the patterns through immersive storytelling and embodied cognition.
I will say, however, that despite our distinct viewpoints on how the brain acquires these words, there is a clear point of convergence here.
Oh, definitely.
We both acknowledge that the curriculum's strategic focus on these specific 8 high-frequency verbs is remarkably effective.
Oh, absolutely. Whether you believe the mastery of went, came, took, and put is cemented through a rapid-fire quiz or through a spontaneous story about making eggs, the decision to ring-fence those specific 8 verbs as a starting point is brilliant.
Right. By isolating the verbs that are used most frequently in daily life and addressing their irregularity head-on, the material avoids overwhelming the beginner with obscure vocabulary. It focuses entirely on high-yield language.
It is an undeniable masterstroke in designing material for adult beginners. If you only have limited cognitive bandwidth, spend it on the words you're going to use 20 times a day.
Exactly. It seems the intersection of structural discipline and organic acquisition will continue to be a rich vein for exploration. For those navigating their own learning journeys, it leaves an open question.
A big one.
Do you find your footing through the strict architectural rules of a map, or through the natural contextual immersion of walking the streets?
Indeed, there is a vast landscape to explore regarding how the adult brain processes, categorizes, and ultimately commands a new language.
We will leave you to ponder that balance. Until next time, consider the words you use every day, and whether your mind sees them as a list of rules or a story waiting to be told.